As we begin, I just want once again to thank the RFS for all your incredible work during the bushfires of the last summer, keeping us safe, protecting our houses and property. It was an amazing effort under terribly difficult circumstances. So thank you. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that. We've circulated everyone's questions and suggestions, looking at the questions, some of them I'm not quite sure that they're the RFS's patch, but we'll be very interested to hear, Marty, what you have to say about them. So let's start with the first set of questions. I've divided them into areas, topics. The first one is the general questions about what you're expecting from this this fire season that's now underway, what you've learned from the Black Summer fires and also from the Tathra fire, and what your current thinking is. So please tell us.
Yeah, thanks, Kai, and thanks everyone else as well. I really appreciate the opportunity to catch up with everyone like this. I think this is a really valuable format and something that we may well be able to use elsewhere as well. So in terms of how we're sitting this season, hugely different to last season. This time last year, we're extremely dry. We had a drought factor of 10, which is basically the scale, 0's fully saturated. We're looking at a lake, and 10 being as dry as it can get. And we'd been sitting there since August. If we could go higher than 10, we would have been higher than 10. So it was about as dry as we could possibly get this time last year. Now, well, I checked yesterday, we were sitting on 5. We've had some pretty decent rain today. I'd imagine our drought factor will be sitting down at more like 4 by the end of today. So that puts us in a hugely different place in terms of our fuel moisture. And the other thing that's really different this season as well is that we're now looking at an environment where 58% of the Bega Valley burnt last season. So that represents, closer to 80% of our forested country that burnt last season. So our fuel loads are hugely different as well. So we just simply don't have the capacity to have a fire season like we had last year. That's not to say we can't have short, sharp fires that are going to be testing for everyone. But yeah, it just can't be as bad as it was last year. The one area that is a little bit different is some of our grassland country. And I'm thinking there particularly sort of south of Bega, the Cantaloupe Wollumla country, perhaps a bit up towards Benboca as well, especially the poorer country where we've got a lot of love grass. Farmers haven't really had much opportunity to restock. And then with all of this rainfall, there's a lot of grass growth and a potential for a lot more grass growth as things start to warm up a bit. So that's going to be our first focus, really, will be the potential for grassland fires. And then we do need to keep a close eye on the season as it develops, but all the indicators are really positive at the moment.
Thanks, Marty. And those questions around things learned from the Tathra fire and from the more recent, more enormous event of the Black Summer.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to reflect on the learnings from Tathra and also from last season. A lot of what we learned last season is that things can be a whole lot worse than we'd ever imagined. Some of the stuff we experienced last year, if we'd presented those to a group as a training scenario, everyone would have said, look, this is too hard, that's unrealistic, you're pushing people beyond their limits, so we won't learn anything from it. What we experienced last year, we did learn from, but it was too hard on people. It was unrealistic to think that people could cope with some of the days that we experienced, and we're still suffering the aftermath of that. So I'm out amongst community a fair bit. I know the community is still really suffering, but it's been a really tough period on our volunteers and on our staff as well. We're still fatigued, a bit disorientated, and realising that we're playing a very different game to what we used to think the rules were. So we are in different times, and we need to adapt to the challenges as we go.
Yes. Can I say, in setting up this session, I've been aware, you know, on the one hand, we've got our community who are really still very traumatized and, you know, very worried, lots of questions and suggestions, and we're, you know, asking those questions and suggestions of a traumatized and still very tired and overloaded RFS. So I think we have to be tolerant of each other's situation and bear that in mind.
Yeah, I spoke a little bit during the last fire season about the concept of living with a campaign fire and how we need to adjust our anxiety levels and our awareness according to the actual risk. So, I was basing a lot of that on the fire danger index. So on days of low, moderate risk, people could take the opportunity to back off a little bit, maybe don't watch the telly every day. And give yourself a little bit of a break from it. And then as the fire weather worsens, that's when we need to ramp up again. And it's a little bit like that now moving forwards as well, that, you know, some seasons we're going to have to live with the risk of fire again, and some years aren't going to be as bad.
Yep.
So we do always need to be aware, but I think, you know, at this stage, this is one of those seasons where we can perhaps take a little bit of a deep breath.
Yes, isn't that lucky? But as you say,
Yeah,
so much has burned that perhaps the risk is less for the time being. Let's move then to that. Let me just check the chat. Yes, so Tony's commented it's a bit like the mentality of quadruple failure is not possible until it's possible and it happens. So we've had a taste of that now. And as you say, all we can do is look after ourselves and be sort of resilient and mindful as we go forward. And yeah, we know it can happen now. All right, but hopefully not this summer. Let's talk about this interesting cluster of questions around evacuation points, fire stations, and one question. Let's do the last one first about the question of whether the Murra should be part of the Tanja Regional Fire Service area rather than the Bermagui one.
Yeah, my recommendation there really is, rather than worry about arbitrary lines that we've drawn in the sand in regards to brigade boundaries, I'd really encourage people to base it on where you've got other connections anyway. So whichever of those communities who you feel more connected to, I'd suggest you link towards those brigades as well. A lot of the lines we draw on maps of you know, response times or bureaucratic reasons, rather than necessarily being a hard and fast for community. So, you know, really, if you've got strong connections with Bermagui, lean that way. If you know, if you're more routinely mixed with the Tanja crew, no drama going that way either.
What do you mean by going that way? Do you mean in terms of volunteering or calling them up to say we want your help?
Yeah, so we don't base our membership on those lines. So if people want to volunteer with any particular brigade, it doesn't have to be, you know, it's not like send your kids to school based on some sort of geographic area. It usually makes sense to do your closest brigade. But if you've got friends and connections with people in another brigade, that's fine as well.
I guess the question's a little unclear whether the person meant, you know, if I want to volunteer, should I volunteer for this one or that one? Or whether it means, you know, are they the ones who are going to come first when we have a fire? My guess is that probably both will come if it's a fire that needs a lot of attention.
Yeah, that's right. So we work our dispatch out on response time. So we know brigades have a different build-up time. So from the time someone gets a page at home to getting to the station, those average times vary within brigades, and then it's not hugely dissimilar to, you know, when you're working at travel times on Google. It'll give you an idea that from this station to that incident will be 22 minutes. We add the brigade's response time and work out which brigade's going to get there first. But if it's a structure fire, we're always going to dual respond anyway.
So if you're at the Bermagui end side of Tanja, you might find that it's the Bermagui brigade that turns up first or turns up. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. Then let's talk about these questions about assembly points and refuges, based, on people's experience of repeatedly evacuating to Bermagui and to the Surf Lifesaving Club and getting stuck there. So the questions are around whether we should do some upgrading, have fencing for animals, because so many people brought their animals in, not wanting to lose them. Is this a matter for the town to decide, or the council? Does the RFS have an involvement in this?
Yeah, so I guess just sort of by way of background on that, the way that side of the game is run is we actually have a local emergency management committee. So the RFS have a seat at that table, but it's also police, SES, ambulance, council, the power authorities. So all the agencies that support us during a fire are part of what we call the EOC, the Emergency Operations Centre. In the Bega Valley, we're really fortunate that that's adjacent to our fire control centre. So when we've got a fire event on, the Emergency Operations Centre get established, and then anything that needs to happen that's not directly fire related, or not directly related to fire suppression, we pass over to the Emergency Management Centre.
Right. So this would be that kind of thing.
That's right. So these sort of issues are nutted out through the local emergency management committee.
Okay.
How
do we contact them?
So council facilitate the meetings. It's chaired by the LEACOM, the local emergency operations controller, who's traditionally a police officer. But council will have all the contact details for that group.
Okay, thank you. And does that mean that the next question belongs to them too? Plans for evacuation centres north and south of Wallaga Lake Heights?
Yeah, so evacuation centres, the LEMC hold a list of places that are suitable for given sizes of events. They're always reluctant, and I think probably wisely, to publish those outside of an incident, because they can well change. And what's a great,
what the incident is and where the fire is.
That's right. Like during the Tafra fire, I know we used the Surf Lifesaving Club at Bermagui as an evacuation centre. Worked well for that purpose. You wouldn't want people going there if it was a tsunami warning.
No.
So that's why we steer away from that idea of there being an evacuation centre for a town.
Thank you. That's really
because
helpful.
Tsunami, we need somewhere really different for it.
And I realise now that LEMC is the local emergency management committee, who coordinates this kind of thing, and the RFS is there. I guess you guys and gals are prominent because you're doing the firefighting. So we think you're in charge of everything, but actually you're just a specialised branch within that larger configuration of different emergency services.
That's right. We obviously provide specialist input into that committee in terms of, we think that fire might impact this area, so don't set up there.
Yep.
Or these roads are likely to get cut off, so that's not a good option.
But they probably wouldn't ask you about where to put a refuge centre for a tsunami. That might be the emergency service that got asked that one, because they're better at floods.
That's right. And then we might be there as a support agency going, we can help out with pumps on the day.
Pump the tsunami back into the sea. Okay.
That's right. We've got some big pumps.
The next one is, hang on, let me just see whether there's anything happening on the chat. So Cabargo Fund Management says, thanks for organising. Cabargo is going ahead with its planning for a community centre that will also be a defendable space at the Cabargo Showground. Also the building's being purposely designed as a bushfire refuge. So it sounds like Cabargo has, they're making that happen themselves, obviously in liaison with the LEMC. Now, there's a question from Sue Ross Kelly. Would you like RFS brigade member for tasks in logistics and staging? I don't understand the question, sorry. So ask it again with a bit more information. I probably would like that RFS brigade member if I met them. Okay, on we go. There is one question here.
I guess just to throw into that question, there are lots of roles for people within the RFS that don't necessarily need to involve jumping on a big red truck. So yeah, help with logistics. The logistics behind the firefighting effort are unbelievable. Just simple things like trying to get enough food to the number of crews you've got, and especially when the number of crews are changing all the time, staging areas are moving. So there's always a gazillion tasks for people to do, other than just being on the end of the hose. So yeah, people are always really welcome.
So this is an offer to help, to volunteer. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue. And I'm sorry I was a bit slow on the uptake there, and Marty was quicker. All right. But there are a couple of questions here which are specifically about, well, there's a question about making the Bermagui RFS station safer. Do you think that that's needed, desirable? It seems a little odd to me that we're suggesting this to you. Presumably you have your own thoughts about this kind of thing.
Yeah, so look, it is an approach we've used elsewhere. I do have concerns about mixing up a safer place for community and an operational base for firefighters. Yeah. Just the very nature of our stations mean that there's trucks coming and going all the time. It's not necessarily going to be a great environment to have kids running around, etc. And also the other side of it is that when our firefighters come back from the end of the shift, they need a break. They can't go straight into trying to help community sort out a whole lot of other issues as well. So there are certainly examples of villages where there's not another good option, and we have gone down that pathway of setting up the station as a neighbourhood safer place. So it's a place of last resort.
But here in Burma, we've got pretty good places that are suitable as refuges. So it's not like a small town stuck in the bush. Yeah,
that's right. So there's good options in Bermagui, places like Neragunda, for example. That was one that was a really scary situation last year. It was a station where we'd done a lot of enhancements to improve its resilience to fire, and some people, no doubt, it saved their lives on the night.
Yeah, wonderful. And we've got some chat from Chelsea Mosley saying Bermagui RFS has just had funding approved for a station upgrade. Time frame 2-3 years, we hope. And then I've got a comment just to me from Tony about the problem with tourists here during the summer. At the time when we really needed people to be out of town and away from the fires. So he's saying management of numbers of people in the town, if only from the point of view of duty of care to them, worrying that Burma has exceeded its carrying capacity for visitors. This is, I think, not the RFS's problem directly.
No, what we ran on was, basically the south coast this year. I was working on the fires out of Nowra before I started drifting back home again. And the tourist leave now zone was an approach we'd never used in New South Wales before. And to see the exodus of people leaving the south coast, it was a huge relief to me. But I'll tell you what, we did get an awful lot of calls from tourist operators who weren't that happy about the approach we were taking, especially ahead of the fire, some of the major fire runs. But they were all pretty relieved post-fire.
Tony's comment was quite long, and I've just read to the end of it, and he says, what power do emergency services staff have to make people leave town?
Yeah, so we're in the situation where we make recommendations, and we can make recommendations to the police via the emergency management, the emergency operations centre. And then police do have the power to remove people if they believe they're behaving recklessly. So they can move people on.
and then we had the state of emergency, which added some powers. But I mean, I think pretty much when the call went out, leave the coast, people were pretty happy to leave as they hadn't been able to get out before. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great set of answers to that block of questions. Now there's the big set of questions on clearing and hazard reduction to reduce fuel load. And the first question is, how does the hazard reduction burning process work? But it's quickly followed by questions, why hasn't there been more burning in the Bega Valley? Although, as you said, almost all the forests have burned. So maybe that's part of the answer.
Yeah, it certainly is part of the answer. So burning in New South Wales is the environmental approvals for burning in New South Wales are done according to the Bushfire Environmental Assessment Code. Mm-hmm. So, which is basically a shortcut around a whole lot of other environmental legislation. Before we had the code, there was something like 27 different pieces of legislation we had to go to before we could get a burn to happen. Now we've got the code in place. It's a shortcut environmental approval process. But that's not to say there's still not some constraints around what we can and can't do. One of the things that's affected us this year is that, actually I'll go back a step. With the Bushfire Risk Management Plan, which each local government area has, we designate areas according to asset protection zones. So it's typically the zone 30 to 50 metres from a habitable dwelling. And they're the areas that are traditionally maintained by mechanical means. So it's the area around your house that you hit with a lawnmower or a brush cutter. And then there's also some strips of council and Crown land that are managed for the purpose of asset protection zones as well, where people don't have enough space on their own land to do that. The next zone out is what we call a strategic fire advantage zone. And that's where most of our hazard reduction burning takes place. So there's zones that we've identified that we get the best bang for buck by burning those. And the next step out, and it's all the rest of it basically, is what we call land management zones. So hazard reduction burning can and does still take place in those, and sometimes fire is introduced into land management zones for outcomes other than hazard reduction. So they might be used for ecological purposes, for example. When we've had a major fire event like we experienced last year, the last thing we want to create is an environment where all of our fuels are of the same age. So at the moment, that close to 80% of our forest that has been burnt, we know it's going to regenerate and replenish its fuels at about the same rate. So we don't want to now also take our unburnt forest and put it all back at year zero as well, and have all of our forest regenerating, you know, from a ground zero of year 2020. Okay. So we actually need to be able to stagger out where we're burning, so that
otherwise the burning task becomes too large.
That's right, and we know the next year I'm really concerned about is moving sort of towards 2014, 2015, as the fuel loads start to come back.
24, 25?
Yeah, I do too. Yeah. Sorry. 24, 25, yeah.
Right.
The next 4 or 5 years, when we see all the fuel starting to come back at a very similar rate over such a huge area, that's where we're going to have some real challenges, and that's when I'd like to be able to go in and start burning some of what is currently unburnt.
Well, that's a really helpful overall picture, I think, to help this group understand how the RFS thinks about this. Here I just note that little point about people's perception that there's a lot of Petosperum growing everywhere, and they're worried that that's very flammable. But what I'm hearing is that you're not that worried, and that overall the fuel load is still relatively low.
Yes. So Potosperum's got to be one of the most controversial plants in Australia, I think. So many people hate it for a whole lot of different reasons, and I get that some people consider it to be an environmental weed, and it's certainly the place in some of the cooler regions.
That's the only bush they had.
Just a moment. Someone's managed to unmute themselves. Right. Just a reminder, everyone, please stay mute. I don't want this to turn into a free-for-all of lots of different questions. If you want to ask a question, use the chat for that. Yeah, that's the deal. Sorry, Marty. Please carry on.
That's fine. And Potosperum is a real sign of a long time since fire. They really don't like fire. They don't survive fire very well. They don't respond to hazard reduction burning well. And they scare a lot of people from a fire perspective, because if you cut a Petosperum down and put it onto a going pile burn, they crackle and hiss, and they are quite yeah, it feels like they're exploding. And I think that's what scares people about Petosperums, that it actually takes a lot of heat to get them to that point. And what's actually happening is because the leaves hold so much moisture, that the crackling is about the cells exploding and releasing that moisture.
Right.
The effect that has on fire behaviour is actually to quieten the fire behaviour down. So purely from a fire perspective, they're actually quite a good thing to have around.
So they're sort of a fire retardant. Thank you. That's helpful for people to know. And we've got some other questions popping up on the chat. One is, what sort of time period between burns? And the other is, what about tea tree and black wattle?
Yeah, so the period between burns depends on the vegetation type. So our dry sclerophyll forests, if they're in a strategic fire advantage zone where we recognise that there's a little bit of environmental sacrifice that goes on in the strategic fire advantage zones. So we're managing those more for fire and perhaps a little bit less for the environment. Whereas once we're in the land management zones, it's perhaps a bit more for the environment, a little bit less for hazard reduction. In those SFAS areas, if you'll forgive my acronyms.
S something areas?
SFAS, so the strategic fire advantage zones.
Fire
so
advantage zones, SFAS, thanks you. We'll learn that acronym.
Yeah, so they're the areas we burn more frequently. Yeah, so typically in our dry sclerophyll forests, so which there's a fair bit of around the patch of land we're looking at.
Dry what? Dry
sclerophyll. So the way I remember sclerophylls are scratchy. So it's that drier forest where most of the vegetation in there, if you're walking through it in shorts, it's the stuff that's going to leave scratches on your legs.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess the species we're sort of looking at are things like the stringy barks.
Yeah.
Probably not much in the way of the tree ferns. As we move into wet sclerophyll forest, that's where we start looking at the spotted gums with a range of different understory plants as well.
Right.
So
about black wattle and manuka?
Yeah, so black wattle, that's what tends to come back really hard after fires. And that's what we can expect to see to come back, especially in our dry sclerophyll forests. It'll come back really hard over the next few years. While they're young, they've still got the green stalks. They're not too bad from a fire perspective, but 5 to 10 years, they start to get straggly. 10 to 15 years, they start falling over. And they can be a bit problematic to us then, but they do also break down fairly quickly once they're on the ground. So there's that window, I guess, from sort of year 5 of a black wattle's life until sort of year 15 that they're a bit problematic to us. After that, not so much. the Melaleucas, which is most of that sort of tea tree forest around the edges of the lakes and things here, it's quite an interesting one from a fire perspective, but it does tend to lose a lot of branches that end up as fuel on the ground. But they do also tend to end up as monocultures. So we don't have a lot of connectivity from the ground to the canopy of the Melaleuca forest. So as they get older, there's more of a fallen vegetation on the ground, which is a little bit problematic. But again, if people have tried to light a campfire with the Melaleuca that's been on the ground for a while, it's usually not very successful. It's not to say it won't burn on a bad day, but it's usually not great kindling. And then the fortunate thing with the Melaleuca forest is that it's actually quite hard to get fire to go from that low fuel state at ground level up into the canopy because there's not the ladder plants in between, which is a little bit different with our dry sclerophyll forest, where there's a whole range of plants that can take the fire from the forest floor up into the canopy more easily.
Okay, there's a question from Gina about a specific situation in Bermagui. I'm not sure we can spend the time on that one, and it's a little unclear from the question, but Sean Burke is asking about cooler burning, the kind that Aboriginal people have used, and I used in the questions the term cool mosaic biodiversity burning, and we wanted to know whether the RFS would support community-initiated cool burns, avoiding flames higher than knee height. And if you think this is a good idea, are there plans to start it, and how will landowners be trained and participate?
Yeah, so we've done a few things in this space. We work quite closely with the Bega Local Aboriginal Land Council, where initially they approached us for some training, but it turned out to be more of a horizontal learning thing, really. There was a really good sort of cross-pollination of knowledge there, where, we had some expertise in fire suppression and running pumps and hoses and modern firefighting techniques, but we also learnt an awful lot during that process as well. And we have incorporated a lot of what we learned into the way we burn it. And we've worked quite closely with the Lalks. We did some training with Merriman's and with the Biomanga Gawliga board as well. So that's been a really good process. And I'm certainly 100% supportive of more burning of smaller patches rather than great big areas. I'm sure, absolutely convinced we get better bang for buck doing it that way. The only limitation is trying to get the hectares on the board, trying to get enough work done when we're using those techniques. Certainly much easier and much cheaper to go and burn 1,000 hectares than to do 1,000 1-hectare burns. But
what do you think
equally,
about community
doubt
groups like this one, learning how to do that and just chipping away at it?
Yeah, so we've run a few throughout the Bega Valley, and we're running one at Black Range just out of Bega at the moment, which we call the Hotspots program, and that's about giving people some basic skills in using fire and the environment, and it's also about identifying areas on a parcel of land that are appropriate for burning and which ones may not be appropriate, and coming up with a land management plan that includes fire as part of an overall land management process. Yeah, so that's certainly something we could look at for this part of the world as well.
Well, then maybe that's something for our groups to talk about, who's interested in taking part.
Yeah, there's some good information on our website about the Hotspots program as well.
Thank you. And then there are all these questions around people worrying about properties near them that seem to have a high fuel load, and whether landowners can be made to do hazard reduction burning. Do you have any comments on these kinds of questions?
Yeah, so our hazard assessment process is really about the potential for fire to impact on another residence.
Yes.
So we don't go around enforcing people to carry out work just because that patch of land might burn. We know there's a lot of land out there in that scenario. It's really about protecting the assets of others, but also about protecting. So it may not just be about your property. If you're concerned that someone's being a threat to themselves by not carrying out work, we do also have a duty of care to work with those landholders to help them provide, you know, some better safety for themselves as well.
And people, I think the underlying question is, can people be made to have a hazard reduction burn?
They can be made to have a hazard reduction burn. Once we've identified a hazard, burning's not usually a treatment that I involve in mitigating that hazard, because if we've identified that it is a hazard, then it needs to be dealt with. And mechanical works are the only guarantee we can have that it's going to happen. There's a whole lot of impediments to burning, you know, weather, time constraints, sufficient resources. So that mechanical works are always my preferred option when we're talking about a direct threat to property.
Right. So send in a bulldozer and a slasher and that kind of thing?
Look, 9 times out of 10, it doesn't need to be a bulldozer. It's usually more about brush cutters and chainsaws and rakes, and attention to detail in close to the asset rather than necessarily clearing huge swathes. I certainly know of examples where people have actually created a worse situation by over clearing. It's about understanding the objective when you actually start doing that clearing work.
Gee. So it sounds like always talk to the RFS.
Yeah, we're certainly happy to help where we can, and perhaps sometimes it's about pointing people towards other resources as well. But we're happy to help in that space.
I think the more we can educate ourselves, the less we'll have to ask you. Now, there is this question about evacuation routes and making sure that they're not likely sudden to be dangerous, with burning trees falling on cars and that kind of thing, dense vegetation right near the road. My sense is that perhaps at the moment, with a wet summer starting and most of the forests already burned, it's not seen as such a priority. But in the longer term, in 2 or 3 years' time, what are your thoughts about keeping the evacuation routes clear? And is that the Shire Council's responsibility?
So, by and large, the maintenance of road verges is a Shire responsibility, and a lot of that work's done for line of sight sort of issues as well. You know, every bit as much as fire. Line of sight issues are an issue day in, day out, whereas fire is hopefully a fairly rare event.
Right.
I guess one of my underlying concerns in having this conversation with people is about the timing of people leaving. If people are getting to the point where they're leaving that late, that fire's already on the road verges, something's gone wrong in the planning process. People should either be digging in or already out by the time fire gets to a road verge.
I was interpreting this as being the sudden unexpected situation where a fire comes much further than we thought it would. But I guess we're all more alert to that possibility now.
Yeah, that's right. So there are always those scenarios. So I certainly don't mean to be dismissive of people's concerns, but I never want people to be reliant on being able to get out at late notice, because things can change so quickly. But if there's already fire on the road verge, then there's a huge amount of danger in taking that approach.
Yeah,
and it may well be that if your place is still safe and there's fire between you and your destination, you're better off staying put.
Right, we've got We've got 20 minutes left and we've got a couple of big clusters to get through, so let's slog on. Fire trails, fire breaks and road access. You know, people are concerned that you may not have the resources to keep all the fire trails and fire breaks clear, though again, in this context, perhaps it's not as, you know, as urgent as it was at the start of the last fire season. But in general, over the next few years, what's your thinking about keeping fire trails and fire breaks effective and safe for your trucks to use?
Yeah, so what's in place there is what we're now calling a FAFT plan, which is a fire access and fire trail agreement, and it's developed by the Bushfire Management Committee. So rather than agencies working in isolation on a quarterly basis, or more often if need be, all the land management agencies and the firefighting agencies sit down at a Bushfire Management Committee meeting. We've got one in a couple of weeks. And we actually work through a combined set of priorities. So with the fire trail situation, it obviously doesn't make sense to look at a national park fire trail, then becoming a forestry fire trail, then becoming a trail on private land, and the maintenance not being consistent across that trail. So in this new fire access and fire trail agreement, once a trail is certified, the Commissioner of the Rural Fire Service actually makes sure that that trail is maintained to the designated standard. So, and there's funding associated to that as well. So we're moving into a much better space in terms of coordination and funding for fire trails.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be a whole lot more money, but it's better coordination of the money that's spent as well, to make sure that, you know, it's not going to be down to every last sneak track that someone rides a motorbike along and thinks would make a great fire trail. We've outlined what we consider as strategically important fire trails, and then tactically important fire trails as well. So
is this this approach with the slightly more funding, is that a relatively recent development?
So the legislation was actually came into place in 2016, but it has been a bit of a trial and error process. It was some legislation that was introduced on the back of the Wombalong fires, where there were some significant issues around fire trails. One of the tricky parts we still need to negotiate is entering into agreements with private landholders. So where a fire trail passes through private land, we actually need to enter into an agreement, and that's a little bit of a stumbling block, where there's a lot of examples where people have been happy for national parks or forestry or whoever to cross their property to access the rest of the fire trail. Some people are a little bit more hesitant to actually add that onto the title of their property. Right. So yeah, it's negotiating that thing between a gentleman's agreement and actually making it a legal agreement. Okay. But we'll end up in a much better place.
And the quite developed suggestion that that we find a way to upgrade Alexander Drive in Bermagui, so we have a ring road right around the town. And the news that the BVSC, we believe, this is just hearsay as far as I'm concerned, is not going to continue maintaining Alexander Drive. And this has been a bit of a topic at several of the workshops of the Badja Forest Edge community, the need to upgrade it to a tarred two-way road so that people have two ways around the town. If we need to get out fast, or if fire trucks need to move around to stop fires coming into the town.
Yeah, so I'm aware of that as an issue, and I know it's been brought to the attention of the Bushfire Management Committee.
Oh, yes.
And I believe it's on the table at the upcoming meeting, which is 5th of November. Oh.
Can you tell us what
So
happened?
yeah, I'm happy to report back to the group on the outcome of that.
Great, thank you.
That's
I mean, email me or Dean, and we'll pass that back. I haven't said that I'm taking frantic notes, because I thought, as well as posting the video of this session, for people who don't want to download it, it might be helpful just to be sent a bunch of notes. So I'll send them to you, Marty, to check that I've understood things properly, before we send them out.
It helps me keep a track of what I've committed myself to as well.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's got to be fit to print. Okay, let's talk about communications and information, which is the last big cluster. So, again, this is about what was learned from the fire, from the RFS's point of view, about getting information to people.
Yeah, it was a huge task. And the scale of things this season certainly showed up some shortfalls that we're looking at different ways of remedying. And things like the fires near Miat, which I know people had mixed feelings about. Some people found it worked quite well for them and gave them the information they needed. Other people had a much larger thirst for information, and the fires near Miat perhaps didn't meet that need. I don't think anyone designing that system ever really imagined the number of people who might be looking at it at one time. And because so much of the state was on fire at one point in time, and people all around the world were watching it. I think it was really easy to forget how huge a news item we were right across the planet. I remember doing an interview with Philip Walker from the ABC in the car park in Bega, and just having a general chat and saying, "Oh, well, I'm surprised to see you here." And he said, "You do realise you're the #1 news story in the world at the moment." And I felt like I should have gone back and brushed my hair a little bit or something after that. But
yes, let's hope we're not that again. I don't want to be the #1 news story in the world anytime soon.
No, I think the royal family got us fairly quickly afterwards from them. But so the thirst for knowledge was astronomical. And it will be great when we can get to the point where we can provide more detailed information. The way things rolled this season, it was really hard, even within the control centre, to always have a really good idea of where all of these fires were, especially when they were progressing so quickly overnight. And some of our traditional means of knowing where fires were just weren't really available to us. And one of the best information sources we have is what we call our line scan machines. So they're the ones that provide us with the infrared images of where the fire front is. We thought going into this season we had pretty good capacity in that space, but with the number of fires that were burning at any given point in time, we weren't necessarily getting those line scans very often. And we were getting wind events that were actually putting those aircraft on the ground. So we had
the scan from aircraft.
Yeah. So some of those big fire runs, some of those really nasty days that we all remember all too well, it just wasn't safe for those aircraft to be anywhere near the fires to be giving us that information, and it certainly wasn't safe to be putting firefighters anywhere near the fires to be giving us that empirical information as well that we normally rely on. So on some of those worst days, it really was a case of, well, we know it's heading towards this village, let's get back there and defend that village.
So have you come up with any conclusions about how it might work better? I mean, hopefully we won't face such a terrible, complex fire situation anytime soon, but sooner or later it is likely to happen again.
Yeah, so we do have more line scan machines this year, and we're getting better information back from smaller aircraft as well. So a lot of, and getting towards the end of the season, we were seeing better FLIR, the forward-looking infrared cameras being attached to some of the rotary aircraft as well, so the helicopters, and they were giving us some great information.
Right.
So
And
things were even improving during the season last year.
it's great to hear that you'll have a better idea of where the fires are, but how will we know, those of us
Yeah,
who really want to know where the fire is as it happens?
yeah. So as that information comes back into the fire control centres more frequently, we can then update the mapping more frequently, and things like fires near me will be more up to date and more spatially accurate as well. So temporally accurate, so accurate over in terms of being relevant and up to date, but also more geospatially accurate. So the line's actually closer to where they actually exist on the ground. Because a lot of times last year, people were complaining that it was just a straight line from one spot to another spot, and that can't possibly be accurate. And like, well, we know that too, but we don't actually know where the rest of it is.
And so one of our members is hoping for up-to-date, accurate information on wind direction within 50 kilometres of her and fire fronts. Is that realistic? I guess we're all reliant on these South Coast forecasts that cover quite a large area and aren't can't reliably predict local conditions.
Yeah. So we've had a couple of portable automatic weather stations for the last few years, and we're actually just investing in some more so that we can actually get spot weather from a location, and then that feeds back into the Bureau's database as well.
Oh.
So that information will then become publicly available. The Bureau of Information is still our go-to for all our weather data.
Right. But you're basically starting to serve as weather information collectors for them.
Yeah, that's right. They're always very careful with what data they accept into their systems. So the units we use need to be calibrated regularly.
Scientists,
probably accurate.
And this cluster of questions around the failure of power and mobile coverage, so that at times people couldn't see the apps, and if they had, listened to the emergency preparations advice and had a transistor radio, they could find out from the ABC Southeast more or less what was going on. Is that likely to happen again, that we're likely to lose mobile coverage if there were a big fire in a few years' time?
A lot of our telecommunications infrastructure will always be a bit vulnerable due to the very nature of sending signals via line of sight. We have to put those towers up on the top of hills, which are also our most vulnerable locations to fire. So there's some work that can be done there in making some of those structures more resilient. And perhaps things like shielding cables better can be part of that solution. But it is always going to be an area that's a little bit vulnerable. There's some really interesting work going on in geostationary satellites and near-Earth satellites. There'll be a lot of resilience in that type of setup, but I think they're a few years off. But that's some technology that I think's got a lot of scope for us going forward.
All right, good. And some groups are finding WhatsApp works well, though obviously it's not going to be so much use if the network goes down.
Yeah, so for example, I was working in the public liaison role last year on a number of different fires, and all of us public liaison officers started up one WhatsApp group and found it really valuable because it was something separate to all the rest of our information feeds. So things like emails, I could routinely get 300 or 400 emails a day during the fires. So it's really easy to miss something, but we knew that this WhatsApp group, was for pertinent information, and I found it really useful. Okay. And I think there's a lot of strength and resilience in having a number of different platforms.
Right. We're nearly at the end of our time, but where should people leave information for the RFS if they have to evacuate, to tell you they have evacuated and where they've gone?
Yeah, there's a number of different approaches that have been tried here in this space. From experience, the front door, a note on the front door is great.
Great.
There were some great examples last year and also during Tafra and Yankees Gap as well.
Mm-hmm.
The people who left a simple note saying, we've gone, pumps around the back, it's full of fuel,
Yep.
tanks here, huge heads up for our crews when they get there.
Great. In big writing, not in an envelope, so you don't have to open it. So you can just
That's
scan
right.
it.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Big and simple. Yeah.
Right. I don't think I'll ask you the questions about looking after vulnerable people within our own groups. But what did you think of the Crossings suggestion of piloting a bushfire prevention corps to engage young unemployed people with the skills of land management and possibly use of fire retardant species, risk assessment, units from vocational education and training qualifications, and to partner up with the RFS, BVSC, National Parks and Wildlife's to trial that. What do you think of it?
Oh, look, I think it's a great suggestion, and there's some fairly similar stuff that happens in Canada, I believe. And I could see it working really well here, with university students, for example, because they've got that huge summer vacation that sort of runs over the worst of our fire season. And if we could engage some of those people back into the process as well, it would, I can see a lot of scope in that sort of thing. And we're going to have to look at ways of doing things differently. We're not always going to be able to rely on our volunteer base with an aging demographic and more challenging fire seasons. So we've got to learn to adapt and look at different ways of doing business. No doubt about it.
And with our last couple of minutes, any comments on people's ideas of doing their own firefighting? Spot fires and ember attack?
Yeah, look, traditionally I've been a huge advocate for the staying and defending approach for people who are fit and able and well prepared. There's certainly days when I wouldn't recommend that, and we saw some of those days last year, that people would need to be extremely well skilled and extremely well prepared for that to be a valid approach. But on days of very high fire danger, there's a lot of people that do have that capacity and do have the skills. And happy to work with community to upskill people to be able to do that, because we know that we're never going to have a red truck at every house. And there's lots of days when people can make a huge impact to the defendability of their property.
Thank you.
But it's not for everyone.
I'm sorry to those of you who've asked questions that we haven't had time to get to. It's been a real slog to get through the list, and even then we've dropped some by the wayside. There's one question from Zena. What's New South Wales RFS's view on domestic fire bunkers?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting space, actually.
Up the end.
There's still a fair bit of work to do on the testing of bunkers and getting good agreement to an Australian standard for fire bunkers. People really need to think carefully about why they're putting in a fire bunker, and why not just investing more dollars in making the asset they're trying to protect, as in the house. It can often be a better option to be spending the same dollars making the house more fireproof itself. But there's certainly situations where a bunker can be useful.
Okay.
It needs to be part of a really carefully considered plan.
We're out of time. Thanks so much, Marty, and thanks for your patience with such a diversity of questions. Everyone, I'm sorry if we didn't ask a question that was dear to you. We've done our best. I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you all for your time and attention. Thank you, Marty.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Great, I'll let you go.
Okay, thanks, Kai. Really, yeah, that was great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All righty. Okay, bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.